1943, somewhere in the industrial Midwest. The air inside the factory was hot enough to blur the edges of light. Rows of men moved in practiced rhythm, sleeves rolled high, skin gleaming under the blue-white arc of welders. Every second counted. Every spark carried the pulse of a world at war. Frank Darden wiped his brow with a sleeve darkened by graphite dust. He'd been on his feet since dawn, watching the endless dance of pistons, presses, and belts. The Army's order board loomed above the line. 12,000 engines by month's end. They were behind. Everyone knew it. At Station 7, a machinist named Cooper had done something strange. The heat treatment oven was supposed to run each batch of crankshafts for 6 hours. Cooper had pulled the parts after 4. Darden's heart kicked. That was a violation, a clear breach of War Production Board standards. He started toward him, ready to shout, but Cooper pointed toward the gauge. Temperatures were stable. The metal glowed perfectly. "No difference," Cooper said quietly. "We can cut hours, get more through." Darden hesitated. The roar of the factory seemed to hold its breath. He checked one of the shafts with a hardness file. The result shocked him. Within spec. Perfect, even. It was impossible. And yet there it was, shining in the light. Darden said nothing. He just nodded, replaced the file, and moved on. Hours later, the line foreman logged the batch as complete. No mention of the deviation. The oven timer remained set for 6 hours on paper, but on the floor, it was now 4. By midnight, production had doubled. The engines hummed like victory itself. Darden leaned against a steel pillar, listening to that hum, the steady, relentless rhythm of machines working faster than the rules allowed. In that moment, he knew something had shifted. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, just necessity, humming quietly beneath the roar of war. By 1943, America's factories had become an empire of motion. What had once been auto plants, textile mills, and tool workshops were now the arteries of the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, aircraft, rifles, and engines at a pace that seemed superhuman. The nation's industrial base had absorbed the shock of Pearl Harbor and transformed itself into a machine capable of shaping the war's outcome. But this transformation wasn't driven by perfection. It was driven by improvisation. On paper, the War Production Board and Office of War Mobilization controlled every bolt, every shipment, every minute of labor. Inspectors flooded plants across the country, enforcing strict quotas and quality standards. In reality, though, the line between regulation and production blurred every day. Foremen, machinists, and engineers bent the rules quietly, cleverly, to keep output flowing. Factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Women worked the presses alongside men. Teenagers fresh from high school learned to weld under fluorescent lights that never turned off. The hum of conveyor belts replaced silence in entire towns. And behind those humming walls, shortcuts, small, secret, and technically illegal, became the difference between falling behind and changing the course of the war. The Midwest was the epicenter of this quiet rebellion. From Detroit to Cleveland, Chicago to Indianapolis, the competition between plants wasn't just patriotic, it was personal. Ford, General Motors, Packard, and smaller subcontractors fought not only to meet quotas, but to exceed them, to prove industrial superiority through speed and efficiency. It was an era when innovation was measured not in patents, but in how fast a machine could turn raw metal into war-winning machinery. The government knew about these shortcuts, at least in whispers. But oversight officers, buried in paperwork and targets, often chose not to look too closely. If it works, don't ask, became an unspoken mantra. The factories that delivered results were praised, not questioned. At the same time, the urgency of the war effort created a paradox. The same system that demanded precision and compliance also rewarded risk and invention. A machinist who shaved minutes off a process could save thousands of hours a year. A furnace operator who reduced heat cycles could free materials for another plant down the line. Men like Frank Darden lived in that tension, between rules written in Washington and the reality of production floors that ran on sweat and instinct. To them, war wasn't fought only with rifles and tanks, but with wrenches, grease, and intuition. The illegal shortcuts, altering heat treatment times, repurposing machine dyes, using substitute alloys, weren't acts of sabotage. They were acts of faith. Faith that experience and necessity could outperform the book. And more often than not, they were right. By late 1943, reports from Europe and the Pacific told a story of logistics and endurance. American tanks arrived faster than expected. Aircraft replacement parts seemed endless. Fuel pumps, gearboxes, and shell casings flowed across oceans in quantities that staggered even Allied commanders. Behind those numbers was a quiet truth. The rules had been broken, efficiently, intentionally, and invisibly. Every illegal shortcut carried a signature, the whisper of a worker, the nod of a foreman, the risk of a reprimand that never came. And together, they added up to something greater than regulation could ever achieve: momentum. The kind that would, by 1945, bury the Axis under mountains of steel, fuel, and speed. As the months rolled into 1944, the War Production Board began to recognize patterns that could not be fully explained by quotas or efficiency manuals. Factories were producing beyond capacity. Engines were rolling off assembly lines faster than calculations allowed, and shipments arrived in Europe and the Pacific weeks ahead of schedule. Memo after memo noted unaccountable gains, yet nobody dared to penalize the plants responsible. Declassified files reveal a quiet acknowledgement. Sometimes bending or ignoring regulations had become essential to victory. Frank Darden's factory was a microcosm of this phenomenon. The shortcut in heat treatment, initially an isolated act by Cooper at Station 7, had spread. Engineers and foremen discussed deviations quietly in lunchrooms and over cigarette breaks. Some suggested new alloys or faster press sequences. Others improvised cooling techniques that shortened production cycles without affecting reliability. Letters from machinists preserved in the National Archives describe this period as a mix of exhilaration and tension. We knew we were skating on thin ice, but every day we shaved hours. Every day the engines went out to the fleet faster. The human side of this industrial experiment was as significant as the mechanical. Workers took pride in contributing directly to the war effort, yet every shortcut carried the moral weight of illegality. Some nights, foremen stayed behind after shifts to double-check tolerances, ensuring that efficiency did not come at the cost of safety. Diaries record the quiet conversations between engineers. One argued for strict adherence to procedure. Another reminded him that lives depended on timely delivery. The debate was never fully resolved, but necessity had become the arbiter. Across the nation, similar stories unfolded. At Willow Run, the giant bomber plant churned out B-24 Liberators at an unprecedented pace, often through adjustments that violated blueprints or bypassed standard testing protocols. Detroit's automotive factories, repurposed for tank engines and artillery, employed unapproved assembly technique to meet pressing deadlines. These practices were tacitly tolerated by military liaisons, who recognized that rigid enforcement would only slow the flow of materials. War Department memoranda from 1944 suggest an understanding. The Axis had no monopoly on ingenuity, and America's willingness to bend rules within limits had become a strategic advantage. Prisoners of war and enemy intelligence occasionally noted these developments. Captured German documents described astonishment at the sheer volume of American vehicles and aircraft. Observers noted that the Allies produced not only more, but faster than Germany could anticipate, attributing part of the disparity to unorthodox practices on factory floors. These outsider perspectives confirmed what foremen like Darden already knew. The illegal shortcuts were not just procedural deviations, but instruments of strategic dominance. Yet even as these practices flourished, oversight remained a silent threat. Inspectors and auditors roamed the floors, occasionally questioning deviations, occasionally shaking their heads at audacious improvisations. Production meetings often concluded with the unspoken understanding that ingenuity would be tolerated up to a point. The factories had become laboratories of necessity, a hybrid of discipline and creative subversion, where human skill amplified the latent potential of industrial machinery. By mid-1944, the shortcut that had started with a single workers' initiative had ripple effects across multiple plants. Engines, pumps, and assemblies arrived in theaters of war with an almost magical efficiency. Reports from frontline commanders highlighted reliability and speed. No catastrophic failures were linked to the unapproved methods. In effect, what had been illegal on paper became indispensable in practice. The quiet rebellion on factory floors had shifted the balance of industrial power decisively toward the Allies. It was in this environment of innovation, risk, and moral ambiguity that Darden and his peers operated, the intersection of ingenuity and legality, necessity and rule-breaking. The rhythm of the factory floor, the hum of machines running faster than protocols allowed, became both a literal and symbolic heartbeat of America's war effort. It was the crucible in which victory was forged, a place where daring and discipline collided, and where one small decision to shorten an oven cycle could echo across oceans and battlefields. This context set the stage for what would follow: the descent into deeper moral and operational challenges as shortcuts multiplied, oversight tightened, and the stakes of industrial production became inseparable from the human lives depending on it. Spring 1944. The factory floor was a living organism. Conveyor belts throbbed beneath the weight of raw metal and machinery, the clang of presses echoing through steel rafters like distant artillery. Frank Darden walked the lines, clipboard in hand, observing the flow of engines, transmissions, and fuselages. Every station hummed with the same rhythm, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of defiance. The shortcuts, the improvised steps, the deviations from official procedure that no inspector could fully track. The pressure had intensified. Allied forces were amassing in England for the impending invasion of Normandy, and every delay on the home front translated into risk for soldiers overseas. The War Production Board had tightened quotas again. Shipments were measured in thousands of units per week, and failure to meet them could have consequences for the entire European campaign. Yet Darden knew that some of his teams were taking liberties: slightly thinner alloys, skipped inspection steps, and faster heat treatments all to maintain the pulse of output. The moral tension was palpable. Engineers argued late into the night over tolerances, stressing the consequences if a faulty engine reached a bomber or tank. Machinists whispered in corridors about the fine line between efficiency and recklessness. And yet, each deviation, each shortcut, carried a subtle thrill. The knowledge that human ingenuity, not bureaucracy, was dictating the tempo of war. It was during one such night that a problem arose. A batch of bomber engines showed minor discrepancies in calibration. Standard procedure demanded a halt, inspection, and correction, a process that could have delayed shipments by days. Darden walked the floor, staring at the engineers debating whether to follow protocol or push forward. He understood the weight of the decision. Adherence meant safety, but delay. Deviation meant risk, but potential triumph. Finally, he nodded. The batch would be shipped after a focused spot check, a compromise between rule and necessity. The engines were loaded onto railcars bound for New York, then Europe. Weeks later, reports returned. The engines performed flawlessly, exceeding expected reliability. The gamble, a product of careful judgment rather than recklessness, had paid off. This success emboldened other foremen and supervisors. Shortcuts spread, evolving from isolated acts into systemic practices. Workers shared methods between plants, ways to shave minutes off assembly, improve material flow, and streamline inspections, all while skirting official procedures. In lunchrooms and locker rooms, whispered conversations carried diagrams and notes. Ingenuity became a kind of quiet culture of resistance against bureaucracy. Yet with each success, the stakes rose. Auditors began to notice patterns in production that defied logic. Some managers received letters questioning methods, though enforcement was inconsistent. Darden felt the tension grow. Every decision carried potential consequences, both moral and legal. He watched younger machinists copy shortcuts with pride, their eyes bright with purpose, yet he could not ignore the shadow of responsibility. By midsummer, the factory's output had surpassed projections by nearly 30%. The illegal methods were no longer hidden in corners. They had become essential. Reports from logistics officers confirmed what Darden already knew. The speed and volume of production were directly influencing the front lines, providing more tanks, engines, and aircraft than Axis intelligence had anticipated. The human cost of rule-breaking was balanced by the strategic impact. The line between defiance and necessity blurred into a single, relentless pursuit of output. The motif of the hum of defiance had become omnipresent. Each machine, each conveyor belt, each welding torch was a beat in a symphony of ingenuity, morality, and industrial audacity. Darden and his peers were no longer just managers. They were the conductors of a vast orchestra, orchestrating labor, risk, and mechanical precision toward a single goal: outbuilding the Axis and sustaining the Allies. As the months pressed on, shortcuts multiplied, and the factory floor became a living testament to innovation under pressure. What began as a small deviation at Station 7 had cascaded into a nationwide culture of efficient rule-bending, a subtle rebellion that produced staggering quantities of war materiel. Yet with every victory came the creeping tension of accountability and moral responsibility, a descent that would test the limits of ingenuity, discipline, and courage. By late 1944, the ripple effects of these shortcuts had transformed the very character of production. Factories that had once functioned as orderly, rigid systems now resembled dynamic ecosystems, adapting in real time to shortages, mechanical failures, and urgent orders from overseas. Frank Darden, walked past rows of humming engines, their polished crankshafts glinting under the fluorescent lights, and could feel the weight of every decision he had allowed, every rule bent, and every moral compromise embraced for the sake of speed. The shortcut culture had grown so pervasive that deviation was nearly expected. Workers anticipated each other's choices, improvising steps without explicit instruction. Engineers scribbled notes in margins of blueprints, documenting alternative processes that skirted official standards but maintained operational integrity. The machinery itself seemed to respond to this rhythm of ingenuity. Presses, lathes, and conveyors moved faster, humming a relentless pulse that mirrored the heartbeat of men and women on the floor. Yet the descent carried risks. One afternoon, a minor structural flaw was detected in a batch of tank engines. The deviation, though small, highlighted the fragile balance between efficiency and reliability. Darden convened a council of foremen, engineers, and machinists. Heated debate ensued. Some advocated halting production to adhere strictly to regulations. Others argued that experience and judgment could safely compensate. After hours of deliberation, Darden authorized a focused inspection and minor corrections, leaving the remainder of the batch untouched. The compromise preserved output without compromising mission-critical performance. The gamble paid off. Field reports from Europe indicated that tanks equipped with these engines performed flawlessly under combat conditions. Soldiers in armored divisions wrote to production officers with astonishment at their reliability, unaware that subtle deviations from procedure had contributed to their survival. For Darden and his colleagues, the success was bittersweet. Their illegal acts were vindicated, yet the shadow of accountability lingered, a silent reminder that even minor misjudgments could have catastrophic consequences. As the hum of the factory grew louder, so did the stakes. Government auditors occasionally visited, probing anomalies in production logs. Darden and his supervisors met them with polished explanations and technical rationales. Sometimes the visitors accepted them. Sometimes they left with puzzled expressions, unable to reconcile the official paperwork with the extraordinary outputs they observed. The dance of legality and ingenuity had become a defining rhythm of the war effort, a testament to human adaptability under extreme pressure. Across other plants, similar stories unfolded. Detroit's automotive lines produced aircraft engines faster than projected. Pittsburgh's steel mills repurposed machinery to meet urgent armor plate quotas. Suburban tool workshops adapted assembly jigs for precision fittings. These disparate efforts coalesced into a network of ingenuity, a distributed system of minor rebellions that collectively shifted the balance of industrial power. The Axis powers, monitoring shipments, could not account for the efficiency gap, attributing it to superior logistics or luck rather than a quiet culture of defiance embedded in America's factories. By the end of 1944, the shortcut culture had become institutionalized without formal recognition. The War Production Board, aware of the unorthodox practices, tacitly allowed them, recognizing that strict adherence to regulations might slow output and cost lives on the front lines. Reports from engineers and foremen describe a mixture of relief, pride, and tension. Relief that their judgment was trusted, pride in sustaining the war effort, and tension over the ever-present risk of inspection or failure. The descent into this unregulated efficiency illustrates a central truth of the war. Victory was as much about human ingenuity as it was about soldiers or strategy. One small deviation, shortening a heat treatment cycle, cascaded into nationwide practices that allowed America to outbuild the Axis, producing more tanks, aircraft, and engines than the enemy could hope to destroy. It was a lesson in adaptability, risk, and the moral complexity of doing what was necessary to win. The stage was now set for the daily grind of the factories, the hidden acts that became routine, and the cultural transformation of an industrial workforce operating under the tension of speed, morality, and necessity. By early 1945, the hum of the factory floor had become a constant companion, a heartbeat as familiar as the rising sun over the Midwest. Conveyor belts rattled in endless procession, presses struck with metronomic precision, and welding sparks arced like miniature fireworks over polished steel. Frank Darden moved among the stations, clipboard tucked under his arm, eyes tracing the seamless choreography of men and women who had internalized the rhythm of production. The shortcuts had become standard, quietly woven into daily practice. Workers approached each task with a blend of creativity and discipline, knowing exactly when to bend a rule without jeopardizing safety. A machinist might skip a redundant polish, a welder might adjust a joint slightly, an inspector might glance twice instead of thrice, all calibrated to keep production moving faster than regulations allowed. The floor had evolved into a living organism, its operators attuned to each subtle hum, click, and vibration. Coffee breaks were a ritual of both rest and counsel. Groups huddled around chipped mugs, discussing the nuances of the latest deviations, sharing tips, and exchanging warnings. "The furnace cycle is running short today," one would whisper. "Better double-check your alloy mix." These conversations were never recorded. They existed only in memory and practice, a hidden code of efficiency passed from veteran machinists to younger recruits. Even humor found its place amidst the intensity. Workers nicknamed the improvised methods: the shortcut waltz, the ghost heat, Darden's gamble. Laughter punctuated the mechanical cadence, a reminder that human spirit endured even under relentless pressure. Letters sent home by employees reveal pride in contributing directly to the war effort, describing the thrill of seeing the crate of engines roll off the line and imagining it powering a bomber over Europe. Supervisors like Darden walked a tightrope between oversight and trust. He inspected stations with a discerning eye, noting when improvisation was effective and when caution was warranted. The balance was delicate. Even minor miscalculations could lead to defective parts, delays, or safety hazards. Yet he understood that the workers' ingenuity was essential, a form of patriotism manifested in metal and sweat. Meanwhile, auditors and inspectors became part of the rhythm, moving through lines without disrupting the flow. They accepted minor discrepancies, tacitly acknowledging that the war effort demanded flexibility. The bureaucracy coexisted with innovation, a dynamic tension that defined the era. Documents from the National Archives indicate that few plants faced penalties, even when deviations were discovered. Success, speed, and reliability trumped rigid compliance. The factory floor itself became a classroom of human resourcefulness. Apprentices learned to read the machine's subtle signals: the tone of a press, the vibration of a conveyor, the heat of a furnace. Experienced machinists mentored them in both official procedure and the art of safe improvisation. Every deviation was an unspoken lesson in judgment, risk management, and adaptive thinking, a human skill as vital as any technical specification. Outside the factory, the world seemed unaware of these quiet acts. Reports of Allied production amazed enemy intelligence. Tanks, aircraft, and engines arrived faster than predicted. Few realized that the success stemmed not from machinery alone, but from the collective skill, ingenuity, and calculated defiance of thousands of workers like Darden and his teams. And yet, amidst the relentless rhythm, the motif of the hum of defiance persisted. Each sound of machinery was both literal and symbolic, a testament to innovation, endurance, and the subtle power of human judgment operating within, around, and sometimes against the written rules. The daily routine, the endless cycle of machine, labor, improvisation, and inspection had become the backbone of victory, shaping not only production, but the culture of the workforce itself. It was here, in the repetition and the quiet audacity, that the seeds of strategic advantage were sown. By spring 1945, the hum of machinery had become more than background noise. It was the pulse of a nation in motion. Foremen like Frank Darden moved with practiced ease through lines of engines, gearboxes, and fuselage assemblies. Workers had internalized a rhythm that balanced speed with subtle judgment, a nuanced dance of human skill and mechanical precision. Every shortcut, every minor deviation from regulation had become part of the choreography, accepted and refined through daily repetition. Coffee breaks and brief lulls were punctuated by instruction and storytelling. Veterans shared tales of past improvisations, lessons learned under the pressure of deadlines, and whispered warnings about the dangers of overconfidence. New apprentices absorbed these oral histories like sacred texts, their hands guided by experience, intuition, and the subtle cues of the machines around them. Laughter, jokes about Darden's gamble, and stories of miraculous outputs under impossible circumstances eased the tension, keeping morale high amidst relentless demand. The line supervisors, while vigilant, trusted their workers in unprecedented ways. Auditors moved through the floors with cautious respect, often choosing to overlook minor discrepancies, understanding that the war effort demanded both compliance and flexibility. These unspoken allowances created a culture where ingenuity thrived. Workers were encouraged to solve problems on the spot, adjusting furnace cycles, fine-tuning press tolerances, or rearranging workflows, all to maintain output without compromising quality. Outside the factory, the impact of these daily routines was already evident. Reports from European fronts detailed the steady arrival of tanks, aircraft, and engines, often ahead of schedule. Commanders marveled at the reliability and quantity of materiel, unaware of the calculated deviations that had made it possible. Enemy intelligence struggled to comprehend the scale of production, attributing success to superior logistics rather than the subtle culture of adaptive rule-bending flourishing inside American plants. This daily life of controlled improvisation revealed the deeper truth of industrial warfare. Victory was not only in the machines, but in the minds and hands that guided them. Each spark from a welding torch, each measured adjustment on a lathe, each decision to shorten a cycle without compromising integrity became a small but vital contribution to a war that stretched across continents. The hum of defiance continued to echo across floors and workshops, a motif that embodied both human ingenuity and the moral tension of necessity. Workers, foremen, and engineers moved in synchronized defiance, knowing that each decision, each shortcut, carried implications far beyond the factory walls. It was this very rhythm, born of routine and improvisation, that would prepare the stage for higher stakes, scrutiny from oversight boards, moral dilemmas intensified by success, and the pivotal choices that would transform quiet defiance into strategic advantage. The lines blurred between obedience and initiative, between legality and necessity, setting the course for the turning point of industrial innovation in wartime. Summer 1945, the factory floors pulsed with relentless energy, yet a new tension had begun to infiltrate the rhythm. Auditors and War Production Board officials had begun asking more questions. Reports of unexplained gains in output, faster than expected delivery times, and minor deviations from standard procedures had reached Washington. Suddenly, the very ingenuity that had kept production humming was under scrutiny. Frank Darden felt the weight of every shortcut, every subtle bending of the rules, pressing down like the heavy metal sheets stacked around him. Managers called emergency meetings. Blueprints, memos, and production logs cluttered the tables. Engineers debated whether to document deviations retroactively or defend them as essential innovations. Darden's hands hovered over his own notes, aware that each line could be interpreted as either brilliant foresight or gross insubordination. The factory floor, once a sanctuary of controlled improvisation, now seemed fraught with danger. Every hum of machinery was underscored by the possibility of inquiry. Despite the looming threat, the shortcut culture continued. Line workers, having internalized the rhythms of innovation, executed tasks with the same precision as before, their confidence undimmed. Yet whispers circulated, "Will they catch us this time?" Or, "If this fails, it's on our heads." Diaries preserved in the National Archives reveal the paradoxical mindset, pride and fear intertwined, a recognition that their defiance had become both indispensable and legally precarious. Then came the pivotal moment. A batch of aircraft engines, produced using the now widespread shortcuts, underwent rigorous field testing before deployment. The results astonished even the most skeptical engineers. Engines produced under the illegal procedures performed as well, and sometimes better, than those following strict regulations. Field reports confirmed reliability, durability, and efficiency, demonstrating that what had begun as audacious improvisation was not only safe, but strategically superior. This revelation transformed the factory culture overnight. Where fear of oversight had once lingered, a cautious confidence now emerged. Darden and his colleagues realized that their calculated risks were not only vindicated, but were accelerating the war effort in ways that rigid compliance could not have achieved. The moral tension persisted. They had skirted legality, but the tangible proof of success reframed the act as patriotic ingenuity rather than defiance. Across plants nationwide, the news spread quietly. Engineers who had once worried about inspections now documented improvements, recommending their adoption as best practices. Workshops in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and beyond began codifying techniques that had once been whispered and improvised. The war effort, bolstered by this tacit revolution in production, now relied on the very methods that had been previously illegal. The hum of defiance evolved into a triumphant rhythm. It was no longer merely the heartbeat of risk, but the cadence of proven innovation. Workers and foremen felt a surge of collective pride, not in breaking rules, but in creating solutions that had tangible impact on the battlefield. Letters from soldiers overseas praising the reliability and abundance of engines, tanks, and aircraft reinforced the significance of these industrial choices. Every shortcut had a human and strategic consequence. Every hum of machinery now resonated with purpose. As summer deepened, Darden understood that the turning point had arrived. What had been an isolated act of ingenuity had rippled outward, reshaping national production policies, influencing oversight, and establishing a model of adaptive, pragmatic, industrial management. The stakes were no longer confined to factory floors. They were interwoven with the course of the war itself, proving that calculated human initiative could amplify national power in ways that regulations alone could not. By autumn 1945, the impact of the illegal shortcuts had fully crystallized. Washington recognized the evidence. Field reports from Europe and the Pacific, logistical audits, and production statistics all pointed to a startling truth. The deviations, once considered risky, had consistently improved output and reliability. War Department memoranda noted that certain processes, initially forbidden, were now being evaluated for broader adoption. The tension that had gripped foremen and engineers gave way to cautious celebration. Frank Darden walked through the factory floor with a new awareness. The hum of machinery carried a sense of achievement, no longer underlaid by fear. Workers moved in perfect sync, confident in the knowledge that their judgment had been validated. Apprentices, previously taught to follow regulations strictly, now learned to combine creativity with precision. The shortcuts were no longer secret. They were part of the institutional memory of wartime production. The moral and operational lessons were profound. Decisions made in real time, based on observation, intuition, and necessity, could outpace the rigid logic of paperwork. The War Production Board began to codify certain improvisations as officially sanctioned methods, yet even as rules were rewritten, the original acts of defiance retained their symbolic power. They demonstrated the human capacity to innovate under pressure, to take responsibility for decisions that balanced legality with necessity. Across the nation, the cumulative effect of these decisions was staggering. Factories delivered tanks, engines, and aircraft faster than ever anticipated. Allied forces received equipment in volumes that shocked enemy planners. Intelligence reports from Germany and Japan commented on the seemingly inexhaustible stream of material, attributing it to American industrial efficiency, unaware that the real story was forged in subtle acts of ingenuity, moral judgment, and calculated risk on countless factory floors. The hum of defiance became a motif not only of sound, but of national identity. It was the invisible link between the sweat of machinists, the judgment of foremen, and the steel that rolled across oceans. Darden and his peers recognized that their legacy would be measured not in compliance, but in impact. The engines that powered bombers, the tanks that advanced across Europe, and the machinery that sustained armies and civilians alike. Yet even in victory, there remained an awareness of fragility. Inspectors could return, mistakes could happen, shortcuts could fail if misapplied. The turning point was not only a celebration of ingenuity, but a recognition of responsibility. Every hum of machinery was a reminder that innovation demanded both skill and care, that human judgment was as vital as steel and fuel in the machinery of war. As the war edged toward its conclusion, the culture of adaptive production became a defining characteristic of the American effort. Factories, workers, and foremen had learned that rules could guide them, but creativity, judgment, and courage determined the pace of victory. The stage was set for the final act, the collapse of Axis resistance under the weight of relentless production, the liberation of Europe and the Pacific, and the ultimate vindication of a system built as much on human audacity as on steel and schedule. November 1944, Allied forces surged across Europe, backed by an industrial juggernaut forged in the factories of the Midwest. Tanks rolled through the muddy fields of France, aircraft engines roared over the skies of Germany, and the steady cadence of supply convoys carried the fruits of human ingenuity and calculated risk. Frank Darden stood at the edge of the shipping docks, watching railcars loaded with engines and armor depart for the front. The hum of machines in his factory now echoed on battlefields far from his gaze. The shortcuts that had once been a moral tightrope were now tested in combat. Reports arrived daily. Tanks powered by engines produced under modified heat cycles advanced further than expected. Aircraft flew longer missions without mechanical failure. Artillery pieces arrived ahead of schedule, ready to sustain offensives. The field commanders were astonished by the reliability and volume of materiel. In letters and telegrams, they praised not just quantity, but the precision and endurance of equipment, unaware that each unit carried the imprint of human judgment exercised under pressure. The collapse of Axis resistance intensified as American production outpaced enemy expectations. German generals, constrained by dwindling resources and rigid adherence to doctrine, could not match the speed or volume of Allied reinforcements. Reports captured in captured Wehrmacht documents show bewilderment. The Americans continue to deliver beyond reason. Their supply lines operate as if their factories never tire. The same sense of astonishment pervaded Japanese command in the Pacific, where newly arriving materiel seemed to appear faster than it could be destroyed or countered. Inside the factories, the human impact of these victories was palpable. Workers like Darden received letters from soldiers expressing gratitude and awe at the equipment's performance. Each acknowledgement reinforced the stakes. The decisions made in the quiet of the shop floor to shorten cycles, adjust tolerances, or skip redundant inspections had translated directly into operational advantage. It was a tangible connection between ingenuity at home and survival on the battlefield. Auditors occasionally revisited plants, yet their scrutiny now took on a different tone. The unorthodox methods that had once risked reprimand were now celebrated in reports as examples of adaptive industrial management. What had been illegal shortcuts were gradually recognized as innovative solutions essential to victory. The moral tension remained in memory, but practical results had shifted perception. Human initiative had triumphed, validated by the unrelenting evidence of war itself. Darden watched as a convoy of tanks departed for the Ardennes. The engines he had helped oversee hummed with life, a living testament to months of improvisation, risk, and quiet rebellion against bureaucracy. The symbolic motif of the hum of defiance now carried a new resonance. Not only the sound of human ingenuity, but the rhythm of liberation, the pulse of victory, pressing inexorably against collapsing enemy lines. Yet even amidst success, the story was far from over. Factories continued to push limits, armies advanced with unprecedented speed, and the moral and operational lessons of the past months would soon face their ultimate test, the final push to defeat Axis powers completely, to witness the liberation that American ingenuity had helped make possible. By early 1945, the Axis grip on Europe and the Pacific was unraveling. The relentless tide of American material, powered by the very shortcuts and improvisations once deemed illegal, pressed forward with unstoppable momentum. Tanks rolled across the Rhine. Aircraft sustained long-range missions over Berlin, and infantry advanced with a confidence born from knowing their weapons would not fail. The factories that had humbly produced these tools now stood as silent architects of liberation, their workers' ingenuity reverberating across continents. Field reports confirmed the transformative impact. Armored divisions reported engines exceeding performance expectations. Air squadrons noted extended operational range and fewer mechanical failures. The hum of machines back home had manifested as decisive action on the battlefield. Soldiers wrote to production officers, often marveling at the reliability of equipment, unaware that it owed as much to calculated human initiative as to steel or engineering. Each note, each acknowledgement, reinforced the truth Darden and his peers had long known. Their ingenuity mattered. German and Japanese forces, overstretched and resource-starved, struggled to respond. Captured intelligence and intercepted communications reflected confusion and despair. Enemy generals documented frustration with American production, noting that their own logistical networks could not match the speed, reliability, or scale of reinforcements. The shortcuts, once whispered about in factory corridors, had contributed to the strategic collapse of entire theaters. Back on the factory floors, the culmination of years of human effort became tangible. Workers watched shipments depart for final offensives, aware that their hands had shaped the tools of liberation. Foremen like Darden walked through the lines with a sense of quiet pride, observing the hum of machinery that had carried both risk and promise. Apprentices who had learned the art of adaptive judgment now understood its profound impact. Ingenuity, exercised responsibly, could turn the tide of war. The symbolic motif of the hum of defiance reached its apex. It was no longer simply the sound of workers circumventing rules. It was the audible proof of human resourcefulness shaping history. Each press, each conveyor, each furnace contributed not only to production, but to the liberation of millions. Factories had become a bridge between imagination and reality, a space where courage and intellect met steel and fire. As Axis defenses crumbled, the world witnessed the consequences of this unprecedented industrial effort. Cities were liberated, battlefields secured, and the relentless momentum of American production ensured that the Allies remained steps ahead. Darden and his colleagues had learned, through months of risk and judgment, that innovation within constraint could achieve outcomes far beyond expectation. The collapse of enemy resistance was more than military. It was a vindication of human initiative. The shortcut culture, once morally ambiguous and technically illegal, had become an essential instrument of victory. And as factories slowed and soldiers returned, the lessons endured. Ingenuity, courage, and calculated defiance could alter the course of history. The focus now shifted from victory on the battlefield to reflection on what it had taken to achieve it. The human stories, moral choices, and silent rhythms of the factories. The world had changed, and so too had the men and women who had turned the hum of defiance into a resounding chorus of triumph. Spring 1946. The factories that had once roared with relentless energy were quieter now. Conveyor belts moved at a fraction of their wartime pace. Furnaces cooled and pressed steel lay dormant in neat stacks. Frank Darden walked the familiar corridors, now transformed by absence. The hum of defiance had faded, replaced by a contemplative silence, though its echoes lingered in every beam, every workstation, every polished engine ready to meet the world. Workers returned to civilian life, carrying with them skills, stories, and memories that blurred the line between innovation and rule-breaking. Apprentices who had once learned to improvise under pressure now applied the same ingenuity to peacetime industries, cars, appliances, and machines that defined post-war America. Diaries and letters reveal a recurring motif: pride in contribution tempered by reflection, a realization that small acts of courage and judgment had collectively influenced the course of the war. Communities once defined by their wartime output now grappled with transition. The neighborhoods around Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago were filled with veterans and workers returning from factories, their conversations echoing with recollections of deadlines, improvised methods, and the quiet exhilaration of contributing to something far larger than themselves. Memoirs describe evenings spent recounting the shortcuts, not with shame, but with a sense of achievement that merged technical mastery with patriotic service. The human impact extended to those on the battlefield. Soldiers who had relied on engines, tanks, and aircraft produced under adaptive practices now wrote letters of gratitude, praising reliability and performance. These acknowledgments, though simple, connected factory floors to front lines, linking human ingenuity at home to survival and success abroad. Engineers like Darden understood that victory had been as much about decisions made in quiet workshops as it had been about strategy or firepower. Historians later reflected on the broader significance. National Archives documents and declassified reports highlighted how adaptive production methods had reshaped military logistics, shortened campaigns, and accelerated the liberation of occupied territories. The illegal shortcuts, once moral and operational dilemmas, were recast as essential components of industrial innovation. What had been an uneasy compromise between rule and necessity became a lesson in the power of human judgment under pressure. The motif of the hum of defiance lingered in memory, no longer audible in factory noise, but alive in the stories, photographs, and records preserved for posterity. Each spark of welding, each accelerated press cycle, each calculated risk contributed not only to machinery, but to the arc of history itself. Scholars visiting these factories decades later noted the faint marks of improvisation, slight alterations in machinery layout, modifications to jigs and fixtures, tangible remnants of human ingenuity that had once defied convention to secure victory. Yet the aftermath was not solely technical. There was a moral reckoning embedded in reflection. Workers, managers, and engineers revisited decisions made under pressure, assessing consequences and contemplating the balance between necessity and legality. It was a quiet meditation on responsibility, leadership, and the profound impact of ordinary individuals making extraordinary choices. The lessons extended beyond production. The experience forged a generation attuned to adaptability, judgment, and innovation, qualities that would define post-war industry, education, and governance. The same ingenuity that had shortened heat treatment cycles, optimized assembly lines, and skirted minor regulations now fueled peacetime progress. Communities benefited, economies expanded, and the cultural imprint of these decisions became inseparable from America's narrative of wartime ingenuity and industrial prowess. The stage was set for the final reflection, to trace the echoes of the hum across decades, reconnecting the reader to the courage, judgment, and innovation that had quietly reshaped history. By late 1946, the full scope of industrial and human effort became evident. Factories that had once operated under the hum of defiance now stood as monuments to ingenuity and perseverance. Engines, tanks, and aircraft produced under improvised methods had helped secure victory. Now, the same people who had bent rules returned to shaping a peacetime world. Frank Darden walked the quiet corridors, recalling the intensity, moral tension, and creative problem-solving that had defined every day of wartime production. Each spark, each accelerated press, each decision to bend protocol had contributed to an outcome far larger than any individual. Workers carried the lessons into civilian life. Apprentices trained under improvisation applied adaptive thinking to cars, machinery, and household appliances. Communities transformed as the skills honed for war catalyzed innovation, productivity, and a sense of shared accomplishment. Memoirs and letters from former machinists and foremen recall evenings of storytelling, not of combat, but of clever solutions, rapid problem-solving, and small rebellions against the rigidity of procedure. Humor, pride, and quiet reflection colored these narratives, showing that human ingenuity, once forged under the pressure of necessity, persisted long after the war ended. Historians and analysts have since examined these developments. Declassified War Department reports, oral histories, and archived production logs illustrate the profound influence of adaptive factory culture on the broader war effort. The illegal shortcuts, once morally and technically ambiguous, were recognized as decisive contributors to operational success. The hum of machinery, once literal, had become symbolic, a testament to the courage and judgment of ordinary men and women, whose small decisions rippled across battlefields and shaped the outcome of global conflict. The motif of the hum of defiance lingers in these reflections, a symbol of audacity, skill, and responsibility. Every engine that powered a bomber, every tank that advanced through enemy lines, every convoy that rolled with precision carries the imprint of human judgment exercised under extraordinary conditions. Factories, workers, and supervisors like Darden had turned risk into reliability, improvisation into strategy, and quiet ingenuity into history itself. And yet, there is a deeper resonance. The story is not merely one of industrial triumph, but of moral and human insight, that even under the strictest constraints, innovation and judgment can reshape outcomes. The lessons endure: the courage to act responsibly, the willingness to adapt, and the recognition that ordinary individuals making countless small decisions can alter the course of events in ways both immediate and enduring. From the spark of the first improvised heat treatment to the final engine rolling off the line, the hum of defiance has transformed into a legacy, one of ingenuity, courage, and impact. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.